The reason they're GOP talking points a good chunk of the time is because these are vulnerabilities of the other side, and they're talking about them because it works, because they're actually hitting on something that annoys people. Okay, we're back with yet another edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm Rui Teixeira, your host, and this session I'm delighted to have Kat Rosenfield, noted essayist and author. As I frequently remark, we try to have the most interesting and stimulating and heterodox conversation with absolutely the best and most riveting guests. So I'm just really delighted to have Kat here today because I've been reading her stuff for a long time. I think I first encountered you, Kat, in the digital pages of Unheard. And of course, I've read your stuff in Pirate Wires and Reason, and now I understand you're a columnist for the Free Press. So congratulations on that. I've been reading your stuff there. You're also a novelist. You've written 5 books. I believe your latest is You Must Remember This, which is an immersive Gothic mystery with a long-ago love affair, icy death, and a rich family gone bad. Oh man, hold on to your popcorn. Now I confess I haven't read that one, but it sounds really delightful. So people interested in mystery should check that out. You also have a Substack, The Usual Palm Tree, you occasionally contribute to, and you do a podcast of your own, Feminine Chaos. I think you have a host, co-host, but she's not doing it with you these days because she's on maternity leave. Is that right?
She's back. Phoebe Maltzovey is
cool.
My co-host. Yeah.
Okay.
That was a very thorough rundown of everything that I've ever done in my life. Thank you very much.
Right. I hope I didn't leave anything out. We'll get to what you did when you were 8 later. But, okay, so let's get started here. Now, as you may have heard, there's been some political news lately.
Just a little bit.
But we're not going to really talk much about that. You know, I mean, all the hot takes have been taken. Who needs that? Instead, we're going to talk mostly about culture today, which you write a lot about, and write about, in my opinion, extremely well and extremely interesting fashion. And that's the reason I really wanted to have you on, because I think a lot about this stuff myself, but I don't write about it. Mm-hmm. And you write about it wonderfully. So maybe we could start with your latest essay on the Free Press, which I might call the stupidification of culture. So walk us through what you mean by that and what you were talking about in terms of developments we see in our culture, because I know I'm not the only one out there listening in podcast land who has been a little miffed about the way our culture seems to be getting dumber and more didactic by the day.
Mm-hmm. So the idea that the culture is getting stupid is predicated on the one rule that I had surrounding my TV consumption when I was growing up, which is it was my mother's rule. Her standard was that I was not allowed to watch anything stupid. And her definition of stupid was actually kind of hard to parse to begin with. But I eventually sort of figured out what the common denominator was with it. It was, the shows she permitted me to watch were things that had smart writing and complex storylines, complicated characters. And they were not too on the nose. They treated the audience as though they were intelligent. They had certain expectations that the audience could handle things. Mm-hmm. And I think that really sort of was a baseline way of establishing discernment and taste for me growing up. That was sort of the point of actually having these rules. Also possibly that my mother didn't want to watch anything that was like not exciting to her. And this was a good way of making sure that nothing too terrible made it through the filter. But now what I see is that the cultural trend has really moved in the direction of stuff that is too on the nose, is very preachy. There seems to be a conviction amongst the people who are creating books, movies, TV shows, and so on, that the audience needs to be handheld to the proper moral conclusions. And you can really see this particularly in entertainment that has been made since, I would say, the election of Donald Trump. It's gotten more and more on the nose. It's gotten more and more explicitly preachy, explicitly political. You'll have these fourth wall breaking moments where a character will kind of like face the camera and start talking about white
privilege. Just in case you didn't get the point.
Yeah. And I love watching TV, and I've been watching some of these shows for a while and just seen the character of them change in this fundamental way. So I wanted to write about how that came to pass and what the landscape looks like now and what it maybe hopefully could look like in the future. And that's what that essay is about.
Right. Well, so, I mean, why is that then? How did the tasteless scolds, as you put it, how did they take over? I mean, how on earth does this happen? I mean, don't people just want to be entertained? Don't they want to consume cultural content that is like actually good? How did we get this foisted upon us, as it were?
So I think this actually traces back to something that happened not in the places where culture was being made, but in the places where it was being criticized and analyzed. This is really about a turn that cultural journalism took. It was starting before 2016, but it really kicked into high gear in 2016 when Donald Trump just kind of made everyone panic. But in the early 2010s, on Tumblr, which is a microblogging site that has had a really undue influence on shaping the culture as we know it right now, on Tumblr, there was this new blog called Your Fave is Problematic. And this was basically a hate blog that was dedicated to calling out the offenses of various creators, musicians, artists, writers, and so on for their affronts to social justice. You know, they were being bad progressives. They weren't espousing the proper political pieties. And this site was very big on calling out things like cultural appropriation, problematic, harmful language. I'm using scare quotes around this in case people can't see me. And very explicitly moral, also really collapsed the distinction between the art and the artist. You would have people being cited on this blog for things they had said personally, but then also in the same post, they would be cited for things their characters had said. Like they had a bad guy in a book who said a bad thing, and it would be treated as though it was like they were, as it was their utterance, basically.
That was their view, yeah. Right.
And so and it's funny, this blog was being run at the time, it later turned out, by a teenage girl who was just miserable and kind of, wanted to feel in control of her life. And the way she did that was by like canceling people for being problematic. But at the time, it really just, it created this sort of tsunami of incredibly sanctimonious culture writing, in which people all started using the lens of power and privilege to analyze everything they were consuming. And there was a sense that you were obligated to do this. And if you didn't, you were an active contributor to the harm that was being caused. You were complicit. You were failing to acknowledge your privilege and so on. And I cannot express how much this just completely overtook mainstream cultural criticism. And I think from there, what ended up happening is that Hollywood took notice. And this is the thing Hollywood periodically does. They see the writing on the wall and they start to tailor their content accordingly before somebody like the state can come along and make them do it. This was true of the Hays Code in the 1930s. It was true during the Red Scare in the 1950s. And it's true now that we have people making this very self-conscious political content. It's like, we're gonna censor ourselves. We're gonna alter our own speech. We're gonna push these political messages out to the audience in keeping with the way that the cultural tide has turned in the press, and in politics.
Yeah, okay. It's still a little hard to figure out, the mechanics of how this happens in a way, right? I mean, you've got this sort of wave of cultural criticism that's oriented in a certain direction. And then people notice it and Hollywood notices, but no one forced them to do it, right? I mean, aren't they in the business of making money and entertaining people? I mean, what's really going on here is that the people who are at the top of the hierarchy are so sensitive to these, this cultural feedback from the people who are sort of the reference group that they don't want to be like bad people, so they do it anyway without even thinking about whether this makes any sense or not from a marketing perspective. I'm just like fascinated by how something like this happens at the sort of the commanding heights of our culture, as it were. How do these people get impressed into the army of social justice when nobody's really forcing them to be in the army?
That's a really good question. And I'm not in the rooms where these decisions are being made, so I can only guess. But I think that a lot of people on the left, in positions of authority in the culture, which is, I mean, we really have a kind of a hegemony culturally of people who are of one political valence, right? They are subject to peer pressure and social pressure, just like anyone else. And I think a lot of them convinced themselves that, number one, they had a responsibility to, push the proper messaging, the proper moral messaging in what they were making. They started to imagine themselves as moral authorities. And they were doing this in the absence of really any countervailing narratives. I mean, a big thing about people who are, on the left and in positions of kind of cultural authority, they have a lot of clout and a lot of influence. A lot of them don't even know anybody who voted for Donald Trump.
Right, yeah. Definitely.
So I think that what a lot of what is happening is this intense polarization that you see sort of society-wide. Everything has started to take on a tribal valence, and we have this sort of fandom politics where the culture you consume is seen as inherently left or right wing, even if it's not explicitly that. So we live in a world right now where things like lifting weights is considered right wing. Watching Yellowstone
is that right? Oh, I better
right
stop
wing.
doing it then. Oh my goodness.
I mean, this is, as somebody who's into fitness and is also liberal, this has been a little bit disorienting for me. But this is where we are now. We really are starting to kind of assign a political valence to a lot of things that used to not have one. And the downstream effects of that, I think, are visible in a lot of places, including in the cultural output from, not just Hollywood, but all of our institutions. You can, look at what's happening in publishing, look at what's happening in museums. This is a very across-the-board phenomenon.
Yeah, and in the process, I mean, and you touched on this, I think, in your essay, we sort of lose track of, it's very difficult to write complex characters. It's very difficult to look at complex events. It's very difficult to have even sort of a typical hero's arc when you're sort of so committed to your political political values you want to impart to people that you can't you can't really portray the complexity, because that would imply there are problems, mistakes, and so on. And in the end, what you get is art or entertainment or whatever that you sort of lose track of the fundamental issue of, is it any good or not? Instead, I don't know about you, but if I read a movie review these days from a lot of the usual suspects about a movie that has some sort of political valence to it, about race or gender or what have you, or about, I'm immediately suspicious of how much they praise it, because I'm really afraid that they don't really like it that much, or they don't think it's that good, but they feel impelled to sort of applaud it because it's making a certain series of statements, implicit or explicit, that are politically freighted. So, it's just, I find this maddening, that we can't trust these people anymore to tell us what's good and what is not, because that's what I want to know. If I read a review, I want to know, is this good stuff or bad stuff? Is this, really well done or really not well done? You completely lose track of the point of criticism in a way, or is it beautiful? Is it moving? Is it, I don't know. What happened here? This is insane.
I think all of that is very true. And so it's interesting you mentioned that this has resulted in a loss of trust in the critical apparatus, which you can actually see sort of at play in real time on the site Rotten Tomatoes, where there are two sets of ratings. There's the critics rating. I mentioned this in the piece. The critics rating, which is from, the mainstream press. And then there's the audience rating, where people, normies, can go on and write their own reviews and make their own ratings. And when you have something that has become politically freighted, as you noted, you will have this enormous discrepancy in the rating of the mainstream critical press as versus the normie rating. So a comedian like Dave Chappelle, who's been deemed, a pariah, untouchable, problematic, he's causing harm, he's transphobic. All of the critical apparatus will pan his work on those terms, even though it is objectively very good and very funny. And so you'll see that his most recent stand-up specials are all rated very, very low critically on Rotten Tomatoes, whereas the audience is giving them like an A+, 90+% rating. And you were asking about don't they want to make money? Doesn't Hollywood want to make money by making stuff that is good? And the thing is that once you start assigning this political valence to art, that is a confounding factor. People will end up supporting it because it's their side, their team. They've made... they want to be part of the fandom. And so there's a sense that you're obligated to buy a movie ticket to something like the all-female reboot of Ghostbusters, even though that movie was objectively absolute garbage. But there was the coverage of it didn't even really talk about whether the movie was any good. It was, look at this effort that's being made to achieve gender parity in the Ghostbusters universe. It's so important.
So important, absolutely.
Right? And you should support it. And if you don't see this movie and you don't like this movie and you don't tell everybody you know to go see this movie, then which side are you on, really?
Right. Damn straight. Yeah, so I think I guess what you're saying, and I think it's probably true, is that the mediocrity of a lot of this content is sort of, at least to begin with, somewhat insulated from the market, because they'll get a certain amount of people who will see it even if it's trash, just because it's on the right side. So even though in a secular sense, over time, your audience may decline, you're sort of insulated from that, at least for a while. Because, but I think after a while, even like liberal people get tired of seeing some of this stuff, that isn't very entertaining. But I think to begin with, it's sort of like rally the troops. Let's get out there and see the female version of Ghostbusters. If you don't want to come, the commissars will be in touch with you shortly, and that sort of thing. So... Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Actually, that reminds me of another one of your essays that I really like, The Princess and the Girl Boss, which talks about what's happened with some of these franchises and some of these Disney entities, for example, as we've moved from the old bad way of, doing Snow White or, The Little Mermaid or whatever, to the new good way of doing these sort of traditional and much loved tales. So talk a little bit about that, because I do think the girl boss thing is really quite noticeable these days in a lot of these properties. Yeah,
I think that this is something that you see in Disney, also more broadly when it comes to the depiction of women and women's stories on screen. We have this thing, I'm going to put scare quotes around it, the strong female character, who is defined, her strength is defined by basically how masculine she is, how aggressive, how much of a leader, how competent a fighter. And what you see then as a result in Disney movies, where a lot of these derive from fairy tales that had, they did themselves have an explicitly moral message, but it was sort of more feminized, and it found strength in like feminine qualities, in being nurturing, in being caring. The thing about Snow White is that she is accomplished domestically, and she cares for the dwarves after, she's ejected from the castle and the queen tries to murder her because, she's afraid that she's going to become more beautiful than she is. So there's also this female intersexual competition thing that you're also not really supposed to talk about anymore in contemporary narratives. But her life is saved because she has these traditional feminine qualities. She cares for these men, and in turn, they care for and protect her. And it's not that this is the only way to be a woman, or that this is the only way we should be promoting womanhood. But the fact is that that narrative has been replaced in the contemporary remakes of these movies with women, heroines who are successful and heroic on much more masculine terms. And you had this very explicit interview with Rachel Ziegler, who's playing Snow White in this upcoming live-action reboot of Disney's Snow White, talking about how, she wasn't going to fall in love, and she wasn't interested in love, and she wasn't going to be saved by a man, because this is all about how she's a strong leader, and she's going to, she's going to go to war, basically.
Right. You go.
And, what I think is unfortunate is that this is ultimately not just a masculinized, but a very shallow way to think about women, to think about what makes women heroic. And the fullness of women's stories, we used to have all of these archetypes. We had the wise crone, we had the seductress, we had the vulnerable caretaker, who is both nurturing but not aggressive, not really a leader. All of these have been stripped away in favor of this very masculinized kind of girl boss ideal. And I think that is a loss just to the artistic landscape.
Yeah, and it's just not very interesting or good. It reminds me in a way of the way art was treated in the Soviet Union and China. I mean, it's sort of like woke realism as opposed to socialist realism, where you'd have these flawless heroes animated by the political values of the Soviet Union or China, and you'd have these basically pretty boring kind of stories that didn't have any complexity in them, didn't have a real arc of change or anything like that. And I think some of these things we're experiencing now are sort of a milder version of the same thing. Do you think the market is barking back on this, though? Do you see change where people are, enough is enough? I'm not interested in seeing this anymore?
Yes, I think there's an absolute desperation for content that is not explicitly preachy in this way. And you can see that actually in the elevation of some of these movies and television shows and so on that are, by kind of classical critical objective standards, maybe not even really very good. My favorite example is this movie Hitman, which was on Netflix. Oh
yeah, I saw that. Mediocre, but somehow refreshing, right?
Yes, but it doesn't lecture. It's not sanctimonious. It has, I like to think of that movie as though it's clear that somebody took all the ingredients of what made like a great 90s movie and they put them in a box. And then they just didn't really shake the box up to distribute the ingredients adequately. It's undermixed. It's, things are a little weird. Tonally, it is an extremely confused movie, and it takes a very strange turn at the end. I won't give anything away, but but it's odd. And yet people they're so thirsty to have something that doesn't feel like it is so explicitly moral and making moral demands on them that when something like that comes along, they flock to it.
Yeah. Amen. I want to see more of that stuff myself. I wanted to talk a little bit about this really interesting essay you had in the National Review about why people keep on accusing me of being a conservative. And I guess the origins of this was you had lunch with Rich Lowry, because as you say, you'll have lunch with anybody you like to eat. And he was like, I was wondering if I could get you to write for National Review, but I understand you might be a liberal? But in the end, you did write an essay for them about that subject, why people keep on mistaking me for conservative. In the process, you talked a little bit about your evolution as a sort of garden variety, early millennial liberal to sort of where you are today, and how sort of things changed in a way that didn't make you question your liberalism. It made you question what people associated with liberalism. So I think that's an interesting story. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, because it goes back to your storied childhood. I promised we'd talk about when you were 8, so this is your opportunity.
Yeah, here we go. I think like a lot of people, my sense is that I have the same values that I always did politically. I've always been like the free speech, bleeding heart liberal. I am big on freedom of expression. As a novelist, obviously that's important to me, but also as a person who likes art, it's important to me. I believe in criminal justice reform. I think there are, a lot of improvements to be made on that front. And there's very little about the Republican platform, or at least as it has existed prior to now, that I could agree with at all. Mm-hmm. And yet the landscape has shifted around me so that I have been left in a very, very different place. The earth moved under my feet, and suddenly, the center is in a different place, and the Overton window is in a different place. And a bunch of people decided, for some reason, that free speech is now a right-wing value. And I'm just still here, like, what's going on? I don't understand. So this essay was, in part, an attempt to sort of unpack how this happened and to understand how so many people, it's not just me, have been left sort of politically homeless in the current moment. And I think this too goes back to the sort of fandom politics that is so predominant right now. A big part of that in any fandom is negative polarization. It's not just about who do you root for, it's who do you root against, who do you hate, who is your common enemy. And because I am heterodox, and also because I'm incapable of keeping my mouth shut when I find something, inconsistent or frustrating, I frequently attract the ire of people on the left who would like me not to talk about the fact that, for instance, canceling books is not a very liberal thing to do. And I think people see that. They see who's mad at me and who seems to hate me the most. And they say, okay, well, if those people hate her, then she must be on the side of these people, which is a very facile way of understanding really any human being. And I think a lot of people are starting to reject it more and more. But that's where I landed.
Yeah, I mean, you talked in your essay about how when you were growing up, sort of being politically formed, just like the right. Well, those are the people who wanted to like censor records and Tipper Gore, and these people were prudes. They were scolds. They were uptight. And here we are, X number of years later, and it seems like the people who are most animated toward making sure bad things are not said and they're canceled if they are people on the other side, which sort of is an awkward position for people like us, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff that the left is now associated with is like not really very left, it doesn't seem to me. And some of the stuff that I thought of as left, like free speech, is like it's right-coded. I mean, you were talking about that earlier, like weightlifting is right-coded. Heck, free speech, objectivity is right-coded to some extent. It's like you were talking earlier about, whether a given movie is objectively good or not. It's like to talk about that is sort of right-coded because, the important thing is what is the movie telling us? What is the important message that it's delivering to us? So this is all very upsetting and disconcerting to those of us who spent our lives being more or less on the left. Do you worry? I mean, I realize you're not a conservative. You can't buy a lot of the stuff in the Republican platform, but I don't know. Sometimes I think, well, okay, if the conservatives are right about, A, B, and C, maybe I should just own that and say, okay, at least on A, B, and C, I'm kind of conservative, if that's where things are coming from. In other words, if they're on the right side, the side you agree with on a given issue like free speech or, I don't know, transgender stuff or crime or whatever, I mean, it's, okay, so I'm a conservative in that sense, I guess. Do you sort of still resist that? I mean, like I said, I'm not a conservative. I'm just saying, credit where credit's due. If they're right about X, they're right about X, and I've just got to, and if they accuse me of, and I know you talked about this too, of repeating GOP talking points, well, so be it, right? I mean, the reason they're GOP talking points a good chunk of the time is because these are vulnerabilities of the other side, and they're talking about them because it works, because they're actually hitting on something that annoys people. So anyway, end of rant. But what do you think about that? Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't at this point. It's sort of no skin off my ass if people want to think I'm a conservative. I just think it's a little odd. It would be like somebody thinking I was a natural blonde. I'm not. It's okay. and I'm not sure where you got that idea. Right. But when it comes to things that the Republican Party is doing right, I mean, point went out to me and I would happily acknowledge it. And I think, you mentioned things like where the Republican Party stands on transgender issues, things like specifically either medical gender affirming care for children or the presence of biological males in women's sports. Mm-hmm. These are issues on which the Democratic Party and their platform is just wildly out of touch with not just, I would say, reality, but certainly with what most Americans believe. You know, they are way, way, way to the left of probably 90% of people. And I have no problem acknowledging that. I mean, I would acknowledge it more, I think, if I were deeply invested in Democratic Party politics, in the sense that, you know, hammering on these issues that are wildly unpopular with basically everybody is not a good way to win elections. But, right. You know, in that sense, it's not that I am starting to align more with conservatives. It's that I've really just kind of stepped back from any kind of political alignment. I don't really consider myself a political creature. At this point, what I'm interested in is observing what is happening and understanding why it's happening. I don't really have a lot of ideas prescriptively for how things should be or what we should do. I don't really have a lot of confidence at this point in my ability to know what is best for the country, especially on topics that I am completely uneducated about. But as a culture writer, I think it is very interesting to kick over a rock and see what's underneath there and say, what am I looking at? You know, and try to understand it as best I can.
Yeah, you sound shockingly normal. Most Americans, you know, like I'm immersed in this stuff up to my eyeballs, but I recognize, and a lot of people don't, I think, who are in this business, that for most Americans, it's like they don't want to think about this stuff that much. And they don't. And they're not, I think you said this in another one of your essays, that it's just not such a big deal what someone's politics are. It's not their defining characteristic. I think you talked about your husband and some of your friends, and it's like, that's not what you think about. That's not even in the top 10, you know.
Right.
You're really interested in the kind of person they are. I mean, you know, how old-fashioned is that, right?
You know, it's funny. I'm aware when I wrote about that, a lot of people on the left were like, well, that just goes to show how complicit you are or how unaware of your privilege or whatever, that you would marry somebody who once voted for George W. Bush. And I am constantly trying to get my fellow liberals to understand that this is an incredibly weird thing to think, let alone to say out loud. Most people just don't care about politics this much. They don't follow it that closely. Those of us who are like extremely online on Twitter every day, drinking news straight from the hose, we are extremely odd. And it behooves us to remember that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. One of the things that I think is really almost maybe sort of maximally representative of this tribalism is sort of the controversy around book bans, which is like everyone's taken leave of their senses in terms of how they think about it and what the realities of it are. So you wrote a fantastic essay, I thought, on Pirate Wires about book bans. So, you know, and I think, and your point is, and I totally agree with it, people are completely missing the point as to what all this is about and what's being lost in the process. So talk a little bit about that, because I just thought it was such a good essay and a good point.
Thank you. Oh, gosh. I wrote that a while ago, and now I'm trying to remember exactly what it was that I said. But I did become very frustrated by the way that book banning was being covered on both sides in a way that seemed to me to be completely missing the point. I do not think that what's happening with respect to, you know, what's being published or what's being allowed in libraries really has to do with any individual title. It's much more about our public spaces and what's happening in the arts and what's happening in libraries more generally. And on the topic of libraries, I think it is very interesting that the library, which was once sort of a politically neutral space, has been very much overtaken by progressive politics, and it's now become a kind of a progressive coded space. And you can see this if you go into your local public library. One of the first things you'll likely encounter, especially if it's, you know, like the month of June, you will see explicit displays dedicated to advancing gay and trans rights and, you know, a sort of a politically progressive agenda. There's really no other way to put it. Libraries are now host to, you know, explicitly political art shows that, you know, you wouldn't have seen this before. That used to be a sense that the library was for everyone. And so when you have conservatives agitating against the inclusion of this or that book in a library, I do think what they're responding to is not the title itself. It's a sense that the library has become a space that is trying to push them out, and that is explicitly pandering only to one side of the political aisle. And that, in turn, I think can really be a sort of a foreboding thing for where we're going nationally, culturally, if our institutions are completely overtaken by just one political ideology and not catering to every American. Some people are going to be freaked out by that, and not without reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as you say, it's, politically neutral spaces are being turned into spaces that are highly politicized. And in terms of the book banning thing, I mean, it's just so back-asswards in terms of, where the, sort of the censoring is taking place, right? There aren't any real book bans, as you point out. I mean, any book you want, you can get it, right? They took McGilligut's Pool off of, the publisher stopped printing it. You can still get a PDF online. Nothing can be really banned. However, you can, in a sense, if you control the curation and algorithmic process that puts stuff in front of people, or what's literally stocked in libraries, or what's thrown out of the libraries because you've hidden it so well no one can find it, that's power. Mm-hmm. That's power. And that's really kind of where we are today, is you take these politically neutral spaces are being turned into, sort of politically purposed in a way that they weren't before, and which makes people lose trust in them, gets people riled up who are on the other side, and so on. And it seems to me kind of tragic, because I grew up, like, the library to me was just the library. Mm-hmm. I loved the library,
Yes,
I would go to the library and get books. That's what it was for. It was so wonderful. And, I wasn't expecting to, like, get lessons, like I'd be told how to think about the world. I just wanted to get my friggin' books. Mm-hmm. So, which brings up the question, really. I mean, I know there's a lot of, craziness on both sides here in terms of, sort of activism around books. But, I mean, who's got the real power here, right? I mean, it's not the conservative parent who's, like, trying to get genderqueer out of, the library. I mean, you can argue about that. But the people who really have the power are the people who, sort of more at the higher levels of the curation process, or even stopping books from being published because they're full of wrongthink. So I find that really disturbing. And back to our earlier conversation, what's left and what's not anymore. That whole thing doesn't seem very left to me. It just seems, like absolutely not the wrong way to do things, and doesn't sort of model the kind of society I want to be a part of. Which I always thought being on the left was about, is like you kind of have a vision of the way you want things to be. That's not my vision. Yeah,
nothing has gotten me in more trouble with my my fellow liberals than pointing out that what's happening in publishing is really anti-free expression, really illiberal, and should be limited, if not stopped entirely, that it is censorship. And to go back to what you were saying about the question of who has the power, the person who can stop the book from being published, who can nip the idea in the bud, who can terrify the writer so much with the threat of social ostracization that they change what it is that they're going to write at the moment their pen is touching the page, that is the person who has the true power to censor. And I think that is something that is not being discussed enough. It's finally being discussed slightly more, but the left has endeavored to pretend, number one, that that's not happening, or that if it is happening, it's a good thing. And, in keeping also with that, a lot of the power of the left to limit what is in libraries is kind of hidden. It's happening out of public view. It's happening unilaterally. It's happening because one extremely ideological person in a position of power is quietly weeding books from a library's collection, saying, well, this isn't right for us because I don't like it, because I think it's tasteless. And people, I think, when they realize that is happening, it absolutely registers to them as a form of censorship and as something that should not be happening out of public view, and that should not be defended as though it's a democratic thing. It's really not.
Yeah, let me read you a quote from you,
Yes,
which I think
please do.
captures some of this very well, and it gets to the question of sort of where are we in this ongoing struggle about liberalism and illiberalism. Basically, you don't smear people like this. You're referring to Lisa Selin Davis, whose book was resolutely trashed by the mainstream media because she doesn't have the right views on trans and gender issues. You don't smear people like this because you're speaking truth to power. You do it because you have power. Hence my skepticism of the idea that the tide has turned on the woke culture war. This seems more like the part where the war has long since been won, and the new regime is strategically, figuratively, drone striking random intellectuals it perceives as a threat to dominance. Personally, I will believe that wokeness, or whatever it is in decline when this particular tactic stops working. And I just think that's very well put. When those kind of tactics stop working, that's when we know things will really have changed. But it's a little hard to look at things today and sort of how a book like Selin Davis's or lots of other things are treated, and not think we're still pretty far, still pretty deep in the woods on a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people underestimate how much a lot of this liberal policy and attitude and ideology has been entrenched at the highest levels of not necessarily government, but certainly our cultural institutions. And it's there. It is now working to set the tone for the culture, for the discourse. It's very, very hard to uninstall that. And I would expect that we're going to be in this moment for a while until a counterculture that is probably percolating somewhere where I don't even know, out of view.
Right. I was going to ask you, where is this? I want to know where this is.
I have some theories. Yeah. I have some theories.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, I think it will take a moment. And what is interesting is we are in this moment right now where the liberals have really firmly won the culture war and are doing a lot of things to kind of spike the football and dance in the faces of their defeated opponents, but while simultaneously pretending that they still have no power. I thought it was...
they're the insurgents, right? Which is completely ridiculous.
There's this very funny spectacle of there's literally a progress pride flag hanging from the White House. And you have somebody standing in front of it saying, we're just trying to have our rights. We're just trying to exist. And it's like, this is inconsistent with what I'm seeing in reality. And so I don't remember exactly where I was going with that. But basically, I think that we have a real entrenchment of one particular ideology, even though that ideology is predicated, at least in part, on pretending that it does not have power and never will. And it's going to be a moment before whatever it is that's going to come and take its place, that's going to be powerful enough to topple it, emerges and starts making waves.
Yeah, until then, as you say, we're all a bit politically homeless, I think, those of us who have a more heterodox view and are disturbed about some of these trends and just want a culture that's more fun and more interesting, and there's gooder stuff produced more often. Mm-hmm. Let me read you another quote. This is from Jonah Goldberg, and this is in the context of where we are politically. And I said we'd touch on this at the end. Kamala, are we excited? I don't know, different than Joe Biden, I guess. Jonah Goldberg said, this was in a discussion he had with Damon Linker, and he, of course, is a conservative. I've lost my appetite for caring whether something is good for the GOP. I don't mean I don't find it interesting as a pundit. Analyzing that stuff is part of my job description. I just don't feel that team spirit very much anymore. To be sure, I still root for the people I consider to be the good guys in the GOP, but I don't see every win for the GOP as a win for my team anymore. And isn't that sort of what it's all about here? That's politically homeless people. I mean, I really related to that quote because it's like, I'm still on the left. Democrats are better than the Republicans mostly, but I don't feel that team spirit anymore. I don't live and die by what's good for the Democrats, just like Jonah Goldberg doesn't live or die for what's good for the GOP. So we're all a bit adrift and trying to make our judgments. Do you relate to that?
I've never really been a joiner, so I I did not have a sense of team spirit with Democrats. I just tended to agree with them on policy issues more. But, you know, I've always approached this from the perspective of, you know, what's good for art, what's good for me as an artist, you know, what will give us a robust culture where, you know, where we have diversity, not in the sense of like everybody looking different but thinking the same, but actually, you know, a culture that reflects the immense diversity of this big, weird nation that we all live in, which I think, I mean, I love that your podcast is called The Liberal Patriot, which is a thing that I think a lot of people think is paradoxical or like some kind of oxymoron, not a possibility, right. But that's me, you know, I think that what makes American culture great is our ability to contain multitudes. And so all I really want out of politics is, you know, that level of tolerance, you know, giving people kind of maximum freedom to live as they please, as long as they're not doing harm to others and leaving other people alone.
Amen, sister. Okay, last question. Okay. I read this in an essay a while ago by this kind of a pretty right-wing guy, N.S. Lyons, but I thought it was an interesting point. He was basically arguing that, you know, all of the stuff we've talked about with culture and how it's evolved and how the left is tending to treat it these days, and the sort of tasteless scold factor. I mean, it's very uncool, right? I mean, it's like back in the day being, you know, liberal or, you know, sort of you were transgressive a little bit. I mean, you were trying to react against that when you were a kid growing up and all the crazy, you know, Tipper Gore stuff, whatever. But how cool is it today to be, you know, on the left culturally, where you have to like toe the line and all this stuff and do all this boring work, and, you know, it doesn't reflect this teeming, chaotic diversity of our country very well. I mean, it's very uncool. So, I mean, is there any like movement, do you think, back toward, you know, trying to have something culturally that really is cool? And do we see this more among some of the younger Gen Z people where they're just fed up with this, you know, pardon my French, bullshit? And, you know, that maybe it's always hard to discern these countercultural movements until they really emerge. But do we perhaps at least see the glimmerings of it somewhere where people are just coming to the conclusion, sort of the standard issue, metro area, college-educated cultural liberal stuff is just, it's really uncool, and it's not interesting, and it's not fun, and I'm going to do something else.
I think you're onto something with this. I have had a theory for a while that the positionality of the church lady archetype, which used to be a right-wing entity, has completely flipped, and now the church lady is, you know, she's got glasses and blue hair, and she's my age, you know, she's in her 40s, she's middle-aged, she's on TikTok, she's lecturing to a crowd about how, you know, it's important to, like, make sure that you don't have problematic this or that on your bookshelf, and that, you know, you have to stand up for this or that politics. It is so incredibly scoldy and sanctimonious, and as you were saying, deeply uncool. And it reminds me so much of people who would be scandalized, you know, when I was in my teens, if I wore a T-shirt with like Marilyn Manson on it. It is exactly the same, not ideology, but the same attitude. And so there is that. I have had a theory for a while that young people are drawn to, like, Donald Trump, not as a politician, but as a sort of a cultural entity, because it is the closest thing they've had in a while to punk rock. And because it scandalizes their parents, it scandalizes their teachers, it scandalizes the man, right? You know, liberals, despite what they would like to think, have become the man. That is what we are now. And so what I see happening, and I think that this is very interesting, this is where I would guess you're going to see something countercultural eventually emerge that becomes a force unto itself. Young people are gravitating towards things that are not ostentatious exactly, but very traditional, very ornate they like, it's sort of the exact polar opposite of millennial pink sans serif fonts, that aesthetic that has ruled for so long. It's like they're into Eastern Orthodoxy. They're into Greek Orthodoxy. They like, they like the Latin Mass. They're into Catholicism. And they're not really religious. It's not really about belief in God. It's about being drawn to the aesthetic trappings of something that just seems out of another world, and not at all like what has been kind of normalized over the course of the past couple decades. And I think that you're going to see more of that, and that eventually that may amount to a cultural movement that is powerful enough to move us in a new direction. That's my prediction.
Wow, that's very good. Very good. You should write that up. I mean, it's related to stuff you've written, but I like that.
I am hoping to report on that, actually. Yeah, I might have just scooped myself a little, but...
So this has been fantastic, Kat. I think we'll leave it there. And I do urge everyone to follow your writings wherever they can. If you're a mystery fan, I guess they should buy your novels. I guess right now you're mostly or more regularly going to be in the Free Press, so people should check that out. But, I mean, I've read a number of your essays now, and I've yet to read one that you didn't find interesting and fun. So, that's as high a recommendation as I could give. You can't go wrong reading Kat Rosenfield stuff. So, but we'll just leave it there. Thank you, Kat, for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast, and especially now that I find out you yourself are a liberal patriot. So good for that. And out there in podcast land, we'll see you next time with Kristen Soltis Anderson, the noted Republican pollster. So see you next time.